Lewis Hamilton's Q3 sector times from the most recent Grand Prix weekend have already been logged, time-stamped, and published in full on the official FIA timing sheets. That part is confirmed. Nobody is disputing the raw data itself, and nobody really can, because it is sitting there in public for anyone who wants to check it. But buried inside those clean, official numbers is a single figure that several people close to the garage say should never have been allowed to sit there quietly, unremarked, treated as just another line in a spreadsheet full of thousandths. Is one lap time really enough to expose how much bigger Fred Vasseur's warning to Ferrari actually was? One lap time. That is apparently all it took. A number small enough to disappear inside a broadcast graphic between two commercial breaks, and according to more than one trackside engineer, large enough to change how the next 6 months of this entire project gets read by everyone watching it, from the boardroom down to the fans, refreshing timing screens at 3 in the morning. It is worth being precise about what is confirmed and what is not, before any of that speculation begins. The lap times themselves are fact. What they are said to mean for the rest of the season is very much still up for debate. To translate that into something that does not require a stopwatch to understand, the gap being discussed is roughly the length of 2 blinks. That is the entire distance being argued about across an entire weekend of speculation. 2 blinks, repeated corner after corner, sector after sector, until it adds up into something measurable at the end of a qualifying lap. In a sport where teams spend tens of millions of dollars chasing single hundredths of a second, 2 blinks worth of time is not decoration, and it is not noise either. According to several technical observers who cover this level of competition closely, it is the exact difference between fighting for pole position and spending an entire Sunday afternoon defending a position nobody on that side of the garage actually wanted to be defending. And that is precisely the kind of margin nobody in a leadership position wants explained to them after the fact, in a quiet debrief room, with cameras waiting somewhere just outside the door. Put another way, imagine 2 runners leaving the exact same starting line and covering the exact same distance, one of them arriving just far enough behind that the door has already started closing by the time they get there. That is roughly the scale being discussed here, translated out of telemetry and into something closer to everyday instinct. It sounds small, written down on a page. According to several people who have spent years working inside these garages, it never feels small once qualifying actually starts, and the clock is running for real, in front of everyone. Here is where the stakes stop being abstract and start being numbers on a page. Ferrari currently sits within single digits of a top 3 constructors' position, according to the published standings released after the most recent round, a gap some analysts describe as uncomfortably close for a team that entered the season with considerably different ambitions. Hamilton's own qualifying average across the last 4 events has been reported by multiple outlets to be sitting roughly 0.4 of a second adrift of his teammate, a figure that has now repeated often enough across consecutive weekends to stop looking like a fluke and start looking like a genuine trend line. 0.4 across 4 straight weekends is the kind of number that some inside the paddock say does not just measure raw lap time, it measures something closer to confidence itself. And confidence, once it starts eroding in full public view on a stopwatch that everyone can see, tends not to repair itself quietly in the background. There is a date attached to all of this too, and dates tend to matter in this sport more than most fans realize. Vasseur's original comments were reportedly delivered in the days immediately following that 4th consecutive underperforming qualifying session, not before it, which several observers say is itself telling. A warning issued after a pattern has already repeated 4 times is a very different kind of warning than one issued after a single bad afternoon. It suggests, according to people who track team communications closely, that patience had already been extended internally well before any of this became public knowledge. So why is this actually happening in the first place? According to paddock chatter and several people who claim familiarity with the technical program, there are 3 compounding issues layered directly on top of each other, and each one is said to be worse than the one before it. The first is mechanical. Multiple technical journalists describe a rear axle that behaves inconsistently under braking load, meaning the driver cannot reliably predict exactly where the limit of grip sits from one corner to the next, which forces constant recalibration mid-lap instead of the kind of committed, instinctive inputs that separate a fast lap from an average one. This particular inconsistency has reportedly shown up most severely in medium and high-speed corners, according to engineers who have studied the onboard footage. Precisely the type of corner where a driver's confidence in the rear end matters most, and where hesitation is hardest to hide from a television camera. The second issue is procedural, and according to sources close to the technical department, the development timeline for the intended fix has quietly slipped at least twice already this season, each delay stacking directly on top of the disappointment created by the one before it, compounding frustration inside a garage that was already operating under intense scrutiny from outside. Some reports suggest the original target for this exact package was actually 2 race weekends earlier than it now appears likely to arrive, a slip that on its own might have been forgivable, but layered on top of an already inconsistent car is described by some insiders as the moment patience inside the technical department genuinely started to thin. But the third cause is the one that actually stings, because at some point, this stopped being a story about metal and became a story about a person. Multiple sources close to the team describe a driver who is, in their words, visibly searching for confidence behind the wheel, second-guessing inputs that used to be pure instinct earlier in his career, hesitating in precisely the moments where hesitation costs the most time. That is no longer a data problem sitting quietly on an engineer's laptop somewhere in the factory. That is a human one, playing out in real time in front of an audience that never stops watching, analyzing, and comparing him to a version of himself that existed at a different team, in a different car, in a different chapter entirely. Some observers close to the paddock have gone further, suggesting that this specific driver has spent the majority of his career associated with a car that rewarded a very particular driving style, one built around late braking and total commitment into a corner, and that adapting to a chassis that reportedly punishes exactly that instinct has been a far steeper adjustment than most people outside the garage originally assumed it would be. Which is exactly why this upgrade package, whatever final shape it takes once it actually reaches the car, is reportedly not being treated internally as just another routine development step on a long list of them. According to people said to be familiar with the project, everything that has gone wrong across the season so far is quietly being repositioned as the justification for why this specific package now has to work, not simply help around the edges. The entire difficult stretch, in other words, is reportedly being reframed internally as the setup for exactly this moment. This upgrade is supposedly the point where the team either answers Vasseur's warning directly on track or ends up confirming every part of it in front of the same cameras that recorded the warning being delivered in the first place. The technical core of it, according to those same sources, is said to center on a reworked floor edge geometry paired with a revised sidepod undercut, both aimed squarely at recovering the rear stability lost under braking, the exact weakness already identified earlier in this discussion. In plain terms, the intention is to let air flow more predictably around the back of the car, so the driver can start trusting the rear tire again, instead of negotiating with it corner by corner, lap by lap, session by session. Some estimates floating around the paddock suggest the targeted gain sits somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 tenths per lap. That number, on its own, is smaller than the current 4/10 deficit already discussed earlier, which quietly means that even a fully successful version of this upgrade may only close part of the gap that started this entire conversation, not all of it, not immediately. Some technical sources also point to a secondary component reportedly arriving alongside the floor and sidepod work, a revised front wing end plate said to be aimed at balancing the car's overall aerodynamic platform so that any gain found at the back does not simply get undone by a mismatch at the front, a detail that rarely makes it into headline coverage but is described by those same sources as just as important as the more visible changes. Now take that original number apart properly. the one the entire warning was built around in the first place. Insiders who claim to have reviewed the underlying sector data say the 4/10 is not one single clean deficit, but three smaller losses stacked on top of each other, largely invisible unless someone actually goes looking for them corner by corner. A few hundredths are said to come from traction zones on corner exit, where power delivery through the rear tire has apparently been inconsistent. A similar amount is attributed to braking stability into the corner itself, tied directly back to the mechanical issue described earlier. And the remainder, according to these same sources, comes from something no telemetry readout can fully capture on its own, a kind of throttle hesitation driven purely by uncertainty rather than any strictly mechanical limitation. And here is the part that quietly undercuts the tidy version of this story that everyone involved would probably prefer to believe. According to one technical source who has reportedly worked on comparable upgrades in the past, floor and sidepod revisions that look decisive inside a wind tunnel have a well-documented habit of delivering only around half their projected gain once they actually reach a real circuit. Half. Not because the underlying concept is wrong on paper, but because track surfaces, tire temperatures, and driver adaptation rarely behave the way a simulation politely predicted they would back at the factory. That same source reportedly pointed to at least two comparable upgrades introduced by rival teams in recent seasons, both promoted publicly, with similarly confident projected numbers, both eventually landing closer to half their advertised gain once real sessions began, a pattern described as common enough that some engineers now treat any headline upgrade figure as a ceiling rather than an expectation. Zoom out for a moment, because the wider championship picture apparently makes all of this considerably more urgent than it might look in isolation. According to reporting on the current constructors' order, the gap back to the team immediately behind is said to be narrowing faster than the gap forward to the team immediately ahead, which several analysts describe as the single most uncomfortable position a team can occupy mid-season, squeezed from directly below while stretching upward at the same time. Some estimates suggest that a handful of tenths, repeated across the remaining calendar, could be worth several $1 million in prize money, depending on where the final standings actually settle. Which means this is no longer just a conversation about one driver finding rhythm again. It is reportedly a conversation happening in budget meetings, as well as debrief rooms, according to people with knowledge of how these discussions tend to unfold behind closed doors. Some reports even suggest that resource allocation for next year's car has already become a quiet point of internal discussion, tied directly to how the remainder of this season plays out, which is exactly the kind of detail that rarely surfaces publicly until long after the decisions themselves have already been made. Which brings this entire conversation back to the only number that was never really about aerodynamics at all. A driver already carrying the weight of a rebuilding project on his shoulders, already fielding questions about form, at a stage of his career where every underperforming weekend risks being treated as a verdict rather than simply a data point along the way. According to several people who cover the team closely, there is also a contractual and commercial backdrop to all of this that rarely gets said out loud in a press conference, the kind of quiet pressure that builds when results and expectations stop lining up in public. Vasseur's warning, according to more than one interpretation currently being discussed in the paddock, was never really addressed to the car at all. It was addressed to everyone watching this entire project unfold, including the man who has to physically climb back into that same car next weekend, regardless of what any wind tunnel printout says about projected gains on a simulator screen. Some longtime observers of this driver's career have noted, cautiously, that he has faced comparable stretches of public doubt before, at earlier points in his career, and emerged from them with some of his most defining results. A comparison that gets raised often in the paddock, but is treated by most insiders as encouragement, rather than any kind of guarantee. So where does that actually leave things heading into the next round? If the floor and sidepod concept delivers even close to its projected gain, once it hits real asphalt, this becomes the turning point the warning was supposedly building toward all along, and a noticeably different conversation begins about the second half of this season, one built around recovery instead of concern. If it does not, if the real world once again claims roughly half the promised number the way insiders say it typically does with upgrades like this one, then Vasseur's warning was never an overreaction in the first place. It was, according to the numbers already sitting quietly on that timing sheet, an undersell. Do you think this upgrade actually closes the 4/10 gap? Or does it follow this team into the next round regardless of what gets bolted onto the car this time? Drop your prediction in the comments below, and if you want to see the follow-up the moment the next session's data lands, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it.